Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
I started this episode planning to talk about a different artist before I realized I was bottoming out on sources that I could read.
Oh, sure.
Which happens. So I knew that I wanted to do a Latin American artist, and if not my original choice, then somebody else. And then I remembered this dude who we actually brushed up against his work in Barcelona, even though he is not originally from Barcelona. And he is a super influential figure, even if he isn't really super well known in North America outside of art circles. His story is also kind of interesting because there's a fun and unexpected toy foray in it. And as I was researching this artist, Joaquín Torres-García, connections to other episodes that we've done just started popping up all over the place, including one person who just seems to jump scare in all kinds of places that I don't expect it.
I like your description of this as a jump scare.
It's just like, and by the way,
Yeah.
here she is again.
Yep. So Joaquín Torres-García was born July 28th, 1874 in Montevideo, Uruguay, which you can pronounce at least 5 different ways, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary. His father, Joaquín Torres-Fredero, was Catalan, and his mother, Maria García Perez, was Uruguayan. The family, which included the younger Joaquín's brother Gaspar and his sister Inés, they lived outside the city center. His father was a merchant there with a store in the Plaza de las Carretas, and Joaquín spent a lot of time there at the store. In terms of formal education, it seems like there was little to none, but from a very early age, young Joaquín was really drawn to art. This made him an outlier in the family where everyone else seemed like they had much more practical vocations, like running shops or working as carpenters.
Yeah, his mother's side of the family in particular had a lot of carpenters in it. When Joaquín was 17, the family made a big move from Uruguay to just north of Barcelona, Spain. And this may have been the result, at least in part, of Joaquín begging his father to do so. But in addition to the teenager's desires, the family had a very real need to make a new start. The bank that Joaquín Torres-Fredero did business with declared bankruptcy and left the family business with nothing. So they boarded a steamer called Chita de Napoli on June 8th and headed to Mataro, which is a little more than 30 kilometers northeast of Barcelona along the Spanish coastline. The family moved into an area of town where his father's family had lived for generations, and they actually moved into Torres-García's grandfather's house.
Joaquín started courses at the School of Arts and Trades, which he attended for a year. He did very well in his drawing courses in particular, and won a first-place prize for figure and landscape drawing. The family moved to Barcelona not long after he finished his first year there.
At the age of 20, Torres-García started formally studying painting at the Sant Jordi Academy of Fine Arts in Barcelona. His classes were mostly at night, so he also enrolled at the Academia Baixas, which was another private art school, and he took classes there during the day. This is a little confusing to me because when I looked up Academia Baixas, it's often described as being like a preparatory school for people to get into the Fine Arts School of Barcelona, but also some people note that it has a more impressive reputation than a fine art school, so I'm not sure what the scoop is there. Just so you know. But here's the thing. The fine arts schools of the city actually became a place of strife for Torres-García artistically. He really did not care for the traditional and conservative style that the Academy in particular focused on. He found it just restrictive and frustrating. He was not interested at all in art that sought to replicate the real world. His personal ideology was that art should create new worlds. This is something that will carry through his entire life. He also joined the art society known as the Cercle Artistique de Saint-Luc, which had been founded in the city in 1893. And this group, which was known for a very pro-Catholic and anti-modernism stance, seems like a pretty odd place for Torres-Garcia because he would eventually go all in on modernism. Simultaneously, to make money for himself after finishing art school, he also worked in an area that seems counter to where he would end up. He worked as an illustrator for a while, working at Barcelona Cómica and La Saeta, which was a magazine about the theater scene of the city.
Torres-Garcia became really enamored with Impressionism during this stage of his life, and studying the work of artists like Henri Toulouse-Lautrec was very influential. In 1897, he had his first solo exhibition showing in the exhibition space of one of the city's newspapers, La Vanguardia Española. That year, he painted a work titled Garden of the Gallery of Fine Arts, and his rendition of wealthy patrons milling about the space reflected the influence that Impressionism had on him during this time.
In June 1897, a cafe called El Quatre Gats, the Four Cats, opened in Barcelona, run by entrepreneur Pere Romeu, who had previously worked at Le Chat Noir in Paris and wanted to develop a space like it in Barcelona. And this cafe became a haven for the artists of the city, and a number of now famous figures of the art world gathered there, including Antoni Gaudí, Pablo Picasso, and Joaquín Torres-García. El Quatre Gats had its own magazine, and the artists of the day contributed to it. Through this gathering place, Torres-Garcia would become connected to many artists, some of whom would become future collaborators. Also, incidentally, that cafe is still open and you can still visit it. So if you want to get some art history in while you're visiting Spain, go for it. Torres-Garcia was also in the circle of artists who would routinely meet at the studio of sculptor and painter Julio González, who became known for his unique modernist metalwork.
The early 20th century was a time of significant growth and change, both good and bad, for the artist. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Joaquin was dabbling in modern classicism, which dominated the work that Torres-Garcia painted up until his 40s. He had his second solo exhibit in the same gallery space as his first in 1900, where this influence was really starting to show. That exhibit was very well reviewed, and it's considered his first significant success as an artist. In 1901, he started giving drawing lessons, capitalizing on the reputation that he was building in the city. Among his clients was a pair of sisters, Carolina and Manolita Piña. Joaquin and Manolita fell in love, but as that relationship was just beginning, Joaquin's father died.
And he was grieving, but his success continued. One of his landscapes, a painting called Fountain of Youth, was featured on the cover of the magazine Pel and Ploma, a journal dedicated to arts and literature in Catalan culture. The Balearic poet Juan Alcover Maspons also asked Torres-Garcia to illustrate the book of poems that he published that year, that was titled Meteoros. Catalan author Narcís Oller also had Joaquin illustrate his book La Bofetada that same year. So he was getting all of these commissions while simultaneously preparing another solo exhibition.
In just a moment, we'll get to a project that Torres-Garcia undertook with a name that'll be familiar to longtime podcast listeners. First, though, we will pause for a sponsor break.
In 1903, Torres-Garcia worked with another podcast subject who we mentioned briefly earlier, and that is Antoni Gaudí. Gaudí had been working as chief architect on La Sagrada Familia since 1883. And at the beginning of the 20th century, he and Torres-Garcia collaborated on stained glass windows for the structure. That project, the collaboration between the two of them, not Sagrada Familia, which is still under construction, although in the final stretch to completion. But the project with the two men lasted for 4 years, from 1903 to 1907. And during that same time, Torres-Garcia was also working on stained glass window design for another church, the Cathedral of Palma de Mallorca.
It was also in 1903 that Joaquin started to put his ideas about art out into the world through writing. His first article, titled Augusta e Augusta, was a treatise on his belief that true art should not copy reality. This was the first of many, many essays, books, and articles that he would produce on art theory in his life, which is why he's often labeled as a theorist in addition to an artist.
Yeah, just hundreds of things that he published. Torres-Garcia also found work as a muralist, and he was commissioned to create mural paintings for public and private spaces, from homes to churches, and also secular public buildings. His work on fresco murals was something that really appealed to him because of its connection with Old World art. In 1904, he was commissioned to create 6 large murals for the Church of San Agostino and several for the Iglesia de la Divina Pastora. He completed the work in 1908, but those works are all unfortunately lost today. The Church of San Agostino burned in 1936, and the works in the Divina Pastora were destroyed during the Spanish Civil War. But in his time, Torres-Garcia was kept really busy with these and many other mural commissions. In addition to the religious commissions, he was asked to decorate the office of the Barcelona City Council finance officer, as well as other private homes throughout the city.
In 1909, Joaquin and Manolita were married after an 8-year courtship. Not long after the marriage, he was called to Brussels for a commission, and he lived there for almost half a year. This commission was for the Exposition Universelle et Internationale de Bruxelles, and Torres-Garcia created agricultural landscapes for the Uruguay pavilion.
While he was in Brussels, he started to work on a book project that was simply titled Bruxelles 1910. It featured watercolor and ink pieces that captured the scenes of Paris and Brussels as he had seen them. That's because after finishing up his work in Brussels, he had gone to Paris before he returned home. And the style of art in this book was also the basis for his next exhibition, which was mounted in Barcelona when he returned home.
Joaquin and Manolita set up a home in Vilasar de Mar, which is near Mataró, where his father's family was from. On April 3rd, 1911, the couple welcomed a daughter named Olimpia.
Torres-Garcia had grown notable enough that he soon had another lucrative government contract. The Palao de la Generalitat, a gorgeous palace dating back to the 1400s, needed some renovation and restoration for its new use as the seat of the Provincial Council of Barcelona. And Joaquin was selected to work on the project by creating several murals. This was an important collaborative project, and to prepare for the murals that he was to paint, Torres-Garcia traveled to Italy to study fresco work there, sketching ideas as he made his journey. There were plans for 6 frescoes in total, although only 4 ended up being painted.
As 1913 progressed, he became fascinated with Mediterranean art and the idea that traditional arts and crafts should be recognized and incorporated into modern contexts. With that in mind, he founded the Sarriá School of Decoration and started teaching both theory and hands-on art. During this time, he was continuing to work on his fresco for the council building. Joaquin and Manolita also had their second child in 1913. Their son, Augusto, was born on June 19th. As Torres-Garcia was working on his mural plans and welcoming a new child, he was also preparing and publishing his first book of writing, Notes on Art. This marked a moment where he was diverging from the artistic ideologies of some of his friends and supporters, as the concepts that he talked about, creating a new identity for Catalan art by using imagery from the past, was not really well received by everyone.
No, and that played through in the reveal of his murals, because in September, Torres-Garcia's murals for the Palau de la Generalitat were finally unveiled, and the response to them was very, very mixed. Those 4 murals are titled Catalunya Eternal, The Golden Age, The Muses, and The Temporal is Nothing But a Symbol. The room that houses these murals, incidentally, is now named after the artist. But these murals use imagery and symbology from classic Greek art as stand-ins for Catalonian peoples and concepts to create a new, unique Catalonian classicism. And arguments about the value of this new style that Torres-Garcia had developed, or its perceived lack of value, played out in the press for weeks. But 2 years later, a stained glass window that he designed for the building was also installed. So even if not everyone liked his work, they kept hiring him.
Torres-Garcia had decided that he also wanted to paint some large-scale murals for himself. And once the Palao project was wrapped up, he started several at Mont Repos, which was a farmhouse that had been home to an art school called Mont d'Or that Joaquin had led after it was founded by his friend Juan Palau Vera. The school had originally been in Sarria, but Torres-Garcia had moved it to Terrassa, just north of Barcelona. When the school closed due to bankruptcy, he decided to stay on the property and make it his home. When the interior decor work had been completed, he moved in with his family and had a large housewarming to show off the home and the work. At the end of 1915, he and his wife welcomed their third child and second daughter, Ifigenia. That was on December 10th. Throughout the 19-teens, Torres-Garcia continued to publish books and articles about art.
In 1917, Spain went through a great deal of upheaval. During World War I, the country had remained neutral, but it had its own problems. There were a variety of economic issues happening at once, and workers' movements, encouraged by the uprising happening in Russia, felt a sense of empowerment, and strikes were looming. Meanwhile, there was also political tension as factions wanted a variety of different things, including autonomy for Catalonia and reformation or even an end to the monarchy. There was also a growing gap between the rich and poor, so on a social level, there was a lot of disparity. And the military was in a state of upheaval at its highest levels. This period is very complex. It's come up on the show before, and we could probably do an entire series on it. But for the purposes of today's topic, the important takeaway is that this was a time of uncertainty, and there was an atmosphere in the air of danger.
As the Spanish crisis of 1917 was playing out, it naturally impacted and influenced Torres-Garcia. His paintings offer reflections of what life was like in Barcelona at the time through his unique lens. His work, Barcelona Street Scene, painted in 1917, shows the world of the busy city in a Cubism-influenced, flattened manner, giving viewers a sense of disconnectedness and a city that seems simultaneously busy, but also not quite alive. After the Catalonian president Enric Prat de la Riba died in August of 1917, Torres-Garcia canceled all of his existing government contracts.
Without those lucrative contracts, he found himself with both time on his hands and also a need for money. So he started branching out into different fields. One of the areas he started to explore was making wooden toys. And these were initially to be used as teaching tools. He used them to show students how simple pieces and shapes could be combined to create more complex works, although his toy making would eventually become a business on his own. Also, to start making money, he once again started giving private art lessons.
In 1920, Torres-Garcia decided to travel to the United States after a brief trip with the family to Paris. He spent the next 2 years in New York and made connections with a lot of prominent artists of the time, including Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp. But while he was very much in the art scene, he wasn't able to generate any actual income, and that was obviously not a tenable situation. So he left New York for Europe once again, although he hadn't made any money. He was more interested in modernism than ever, and it became the prevalent influence on his work from that point on.
In 1922, when he returned to Europe, he didn't go back to Barcelona, and he never did. He went instead to Italy, and there he founded the Aladdin Toy Company. He actually started to do a decent bit of business in the toy space, and he was taking orders from big department stores, many of them in other countries in some cases. And his toys are interesting because they look a lot like his other art. The forms they represent are slightly abstracted and even cubist. For example, wooden figures made to look sort of like men feature very squared faces, and their arms are not separated from their body. They're cut as one continuous piece of wood, and they're only delineated, for example, by a small stripe of paint that hints at a cuff sitting above the hand. So he was finding some business success with this toy work. On the family front, he and Manolito welcomed their fourth child, Horatio, while they were living in Italy in 1924. But he wasn't painting, and it wasn't until U.S. artist Charles Lagassa, who was in Europe and planning a group exhibition in Paris, encouraged him to pick up his brush again that Torres-Garcia once again started painting.
That exhibition went very well, and the positive reception led to a move to Paris in 1926. Like many artists we have talked about on the show in the past, Torres-Garcia applied to be included in the Paris Salon. But he was denied entry. So in 1928, he and 4 other artists mounted their own show, titled Five Artists Refused by the Jury of the Autumn Salon. This was a movement in Paris where a lot of artists came out in solidarity, and as a consequence, Joaquin found himself with a fresh circle of friends. Together, he and several others formed a group known as Cercle et Carré, or Circle and Square. Cercle et Carré had its own magazine, and as an organization, it promoted constructivism as an art movement.
And coming up, we will talk more about constructivism and how Torres-Garcia implemented it in his work. But first, we will hear from the sponsors that keep the show going. Constructivism became very important to Torres-Garcia in the 1920s. So the movement of constructivism in art makes use of geometric shapes and materials often used in literal building construction or other industrial pursuits to create the finished work. And this movement began in Russia in 1917, and it embraced this spare, abstract aesthetic that's intended to mirror the modern world. This interest on Torres-Garcia's part makes sense because it ties together the work that he was doing with toys into the more abstract work of art. Many of Torres-Garcia's most famous paintings of his constructivist period feature what is essentially a loose grid structure, with each section of that grid filled in with different images, almost like a modernist painting of a shadow box or a curio cabinet.
Just as it seemed as though Torres-Garcia had really hit a stride and found a supportive and invigorating group of colleagues, Paris hit an economic wall in 1932. Of course, along with a lot of the rest of the world, because the Great Depression had finally made its way to Europe. And in France's capital, that meant unemployment soared, tourism really evaporated, and factories shut down. As the financial collapse played out, Torres-Garcia took his family to Madrid. He and several of the artists from his group show in Paris got another group together called Grupo Constructivo and even published several guides on art. But Madrid really didn't keep Joaquin's attention. He started to think about South America. In 1934, he left Europe behind for good, bringing Manolita and the children to his home country of Uruguay.
After living in Europe for more than 40 years, Joaquín Torres-García returned to Montevideo. And this time, he had a very specific goal. He wanted to bring constructivism and modernism to Latin America. He believed and taught that modern art, and specifically the constructivist universalist movement, offered the world a chance to see things that were not bound by the rules of classic aestheticism. And so those pieces of art would enable them to access a deeper understanding of the world and life as they sought to understand the art. This was a case where he really walked the walk in terms of wanting to promote his ideas. He went on radio shows to talk about them, and he wrote articles about them, and he gave lectures, and he edited art journals, and he basically did everything he could to promote modernism.
He continued to make new avenues to share his ideas about art. As part of his vision for bringing all of the arts together and bridging communication between the art world and the public, he formed the Uruguay Society of Arts. He started organizing group exhibits that showcased a wide range of Uruguayan artists and also included foreign visitors to the country from time to time. He also started showing his work alongside that of his son, Augusto. All of the Torres-Garcia children were artistic, and 3 of them went on to be artists in their own right. He became an honorary member of the faculty at the Montevideo School of Architecture in 1934. He also formed a workshop called School of the South, which encouraged artists to focus on their local inspirations instead of aspiring to anything going on in Europe.
As part of his effort to teach his art theory, he founded the Association of Constructivist Art in 1935. Pre-Columbian art had started to really influence Torres-Garcia's work in the 1930s, and it informed the way that he viewed modernism. He used the Association of Constructivist Art to share information and ideas about the future of art and how modernism should be part of Latin American art, and that Latin America, with all of its history, should have a voice and its own influence on the modernist movement.
This mode of thinking was not well received by everyone, though. A lot of the art scene in Uruguay was still very devoted to the idea that the European art establishment was superior to all the others, and all this rhetoric about shaking everything up seemed extremist. Torres Garcia soon came to be viewed as a firebrand of the art world. He formed a Latin American version of Circle and Square, with the motto of the group and its publication being total intransigence against naturalism.
In 1938, he created a work of sculpture called Monumento Cosmico. It's a very famous work of art, and it's a fascinating sculpture because it looks very, very much like a giant version of one of his paintings. The grid is in play. This work is essentially a giant slab of pink granite. It's 300 by 560 by 45 centimeters, or 118 by 220 by 18 inches. And it features the uneven grid pattern that he used in many of his paintings, particularly when he was in Paris, and there's a symbol or image occupying each space. This well-known work is part of the collection of the Uruguay National Museum of Visual Arts, and it remains on display in the garden there. And some of these symbols are somewhat mystical in nature, and that ties to a person who seems to pop up on the show, even in places we do not expect, and that is Madame Blavatsky. I just feel like she's everywhere. Torres-Garcia had joined the Theosophy Society in the early 1930s, and he was drawn to its mystic visuals and the idea of a universal brotherhood that the ideology of Theosophy preached. And that falls very much in line with his efforts to unify the art world in various ways, so it's not entirely surprising that he would align with it. Torres-Garcia even gave a lecture at the Theosophy Society discussing geometry and proportion. But that is but one of roughly 600 lectures that he gave after moving back to Uruguay. So it's unclear if he was super active in the organization or it was just one of the many influences that he incorporated into his work.
In 1943, he opened a workshop called Taller Torres Garcia, which focused on teaching constructivism in its curriculum. Shortly after founding this group, he published a book titled Universalismo Constructivo, which included a lot of his lectures and was intended to show the way art and culture could be united. The book also featured more than 250 drawings by the author.
Also in 1943, he created one of his most famous works. That's an ink sketch titled America Invertida. And it is, as that title hints, a crude map of South America rendered upside down. A large S sits at the top of the piece, replacing the idea of north as the most important direction. And this, too, falls very much in line with his School of the South ideology, of which he wrote, quote, "I have called this the School of the South because in reality, our north is the South. There must not be north for us except in opposition to our South. Therefore, we now turn the map upside down, and then we have a true idea of our position, and not as the rest of the world wishes. The point of America from now on, forever, insistently points to the South, our North."
In 1948, Torres Garcia had a new home built at 5612 Caramuru Street in Montevideo. He and the family moved into the home in 1949, but Joaquin did not get to enjoy it for long. He died on August 8th of 1949.
After his death, his workshop school continued for more than a decade, run by his students and supporters, and magazines continued to be published by the organization, and it was incredibly influential in the world of Latin American modern art before it shuttered in the 1960s.
In a tragic turn of events, many of Torres-Garcia's works were destroyed in a fire in 1978. A comprehensive retrospective exhibit had been mounted at the Rio de Janeiro Museum of Modern Art, and the museum lost 90% of its total collection in the blaze. In addition to the work of Torres-Garcia, there were pieces by Paul Klee, René Magritte, Juan Miro, Max Ernst, and Salvador Dalí were also lost.
Joaquín Torres-García can be difficult to succinctly summarize because he had so many ideas that had at their center this sort of push and pull of old and new concepts that might seem at odds, but which he sought to unify. And I found the best articulation of this quality in my research in the writing of Alvaro Medina, who wrote about him for Art Nexus, writing, quote, Joaquín Torres-García is a paradox. He is one of the Latin American painters who spent the most time in Europe and the only one who seriously proposed to forget about Europe. But he was never a partisan of nationalist art and never practiced such art. Unlike the Mexican muralists, who in a sense were his contemporaries, the Uruguayan painter was the champion of Universalism and relentlessly criticized nativism. He criticized it and at the same time theorized and practiced in his own manner and imposed among his disciples in his own studio an art based on the geometric principles of architecture, sculpture, painting, ceramics, goldwork, and the textiles of the Aboriginal peoples of America. That is Joaquín Torres-García, who I wish, oh, how I wish we had more of his work that we could still look at.
Yeah.
But because that fire happened before a lot of things were captured digitally, some things we only have descriptions of, and we will not see them if we didn't live at a time when they were visible, which is a pity. I have more Orange Tabby email.
Yay!
This is from our listener, Rosemary, and it's titled My Stoic Orange Tabby. Rosemary writes, Hi, Holly and Tracy. I love the podcast and have been listening to it for many years. History was always one of my favorite subjects in school, so I'm happy to be continuously expanding my knowledge. The podcast has even taught me things about my hometown of Los Angeles that I never knew about. In one of your episodes, I heard the call to find an intelligent orange tabby. Well, I present to you Rusty, my female orange tuxie. She was my first cat. We adopted her when she was 6 from a nearby shelter. It took her 3 years to trust us, but after that, she was the sweetest girl. She knew when to cuddle if we were sick. She was always very calm, and she would say bless you if you sneezed. She had her silly moments, but I think most cats do. She lived to the age of 21, and I still miss her every day. Thank you for all the knowledge. Okay, Rusty is so cute. I am loving all of the smart orange cat email, by the way. Keep it coming. It delights me. As I've said, I'm kind of in a orange cats on my wish list for the future phase. So I don't care if I get a ding dong or a smart one, though. I just want kitties. She's so cute, though. And she has those big, what's called the classic tabby swirls. You know how the striping, like the multiple stripes is called like a modern tabby, and the big swirlies that almost look like targets is actually what's called a classic tabby. And she is very cute. And I'm so glad that she gave you so many years of delight and love and comfort and bless yous. If you would like to share your cats with us or anything else that's on your mind, you can do so at historypodcast@iheartradio.com. You can also subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app or anywhere you listen to your favorite shows.
Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.